Sweden was once seen as a symbol of social and economic stability and consistently ranks as one of the happiest nations. But in recent years, gun crime has rocketed, challenging the country's long-standing reputation. Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, guns, gangs and children recruited to commit violent crimes. This is the other side to Sweden. Once the safest of countries in Europe, it is now one of the most dangerous. So, what lies behind Sweden's terrible transformation?
Sweden is no longer just known for ABBA, meatballs or its practical furniture. Now it's becoming renowned for its gun crime rates, which are one of the highest in Europe. An increase in shootings and bombings has cast a shadow over the country's democratic and peaceful reputation.
When you shoot somebody in a shopping center in the middle of the day, on the street in the middle of the day, when you have detonations where people are sleeping in apartment houses, of course that affects how you feel. So the feeling of unsafety, it is a major issue for us.
In 2022, a record 62 people were shot dead in Sweden. Although the number dropped slightly in 2023, the rise in female and minor victims have prompted concern.
Sometimes they happen like in gang-related territories, but now or even at night, but now it's more broad daylight, public spaces.
Children are also being used by gang members to commit crimes, with the violence extending beyond Sweden's border. Its government has started initiatives to tackle gang violence. These include increasing prison sentences and lowering the age of criminal responsibility due to the increase in children committing crimes. Sweden's center-right government is also tightening its immigration policy, reversing its once liberal rules. Gun crime and the drugs trade are being linked to poor integration of its large migrant community. The struggle with gang violence seems to remain a continuous challenge for Sweden and its Nordic neighbors. How can Sweden ultimately address and solve the root causes of this gun crime crisis?
Well, let's meet our guests. In Malmo, in Sweden, we have Kim Moeller, who is Associate Professor of Criminology at Malmo University in Sweden. In Chester, in England, we have Paul French. He's a Doctor of Criminology. That's at the University of Chester. And in Brussels, Nils Duquet, he is director of the Flemish Peace Institute, which is an organisation associated with the Flemish Parliament. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Kim, I'll start with you first of all. Swedish police reckon there are about 62,000 people in your country associated with organised crime gangs. That's in a country of less than 11 million people. These figures, if they're true, are extraordinary.
Yes, it is an extraordinarily high number, but I think the word associated is doing quite a bit of work here. So associations with a gang member could be related to. So they include family members as well. So people that are somehow connected to these suspected gang members. The actual number of gang members is significantly lower, but still, yes, everyone is very concerned with the current situation and taking this problem very, very seriously.
And Kim, just how worrying is it for Swedish people that, the international news media look in and this is not the Sweden that people know and love? There's a very dark underbelly here.
Yes, and the recentness of it all. So this has happened over the past 15, 20 years. We've had problems with organized criminal gangs before, but mostly in the shape of these outlaw biker gangs, the Hells Angels and the Bandidos. This new phenomenon of these more locally oriented street gangs that then develop into more serious criminal threats. It's brand new, and it is a big departure from the Swedish welfare states that we've known and loved for the past 100 years. And most worryingly, nobody really knows what on earth to do about it.
Just on that point, Paul, what can be done about it? I mean, how serious is the situation now? What do you think the Swedish authorities should be doing?
I mean, having that perspective of an outsider looking in, you know, it's certainly a multifaceted issue. From what I've been able to learn of Sweden over the recent years and how it's progressed, it very much, to me, fits in with sort of more classical sort of theories of gang memberships and how gang formations kind of come to be. So if we take some of those classic considerations of gang theories and apply them to recent developments in Sweden, I mean, we have seen, I don't know if dramatic's the right word, but we have seen relatively sort of steep immigration rises, particularly over the last maybe 14 to 15 years, could be longer than that, but let's just take that sort of time frame as a bit of an example, alongside what other European nations have seen as well, which is growing economic disparities. And, you know, a lot of times whenever there is high numbers of immigration, historically speaking, to certain areas, it's people who, for, you know, unfortunate reasons often, but regardless, aren't leaving their homeland because they're affluent or, you know, they're maybe living the most prosperous life. So where they end up, they're typically at the, not always, but typically or often at the bottom of the economic sort of ladder, shall we say. And they join other natives at those positions as well. So where they leave for more prosperity or they leave to get away from conflict, whatever it is, it seems like Sweden has been maybe ill-equipped to provide legitimate opportunity structures for them, as well as maybe some of the Swedish natives already there. And this, it creates a bit of a power vacuum often, where there is illegal opportunity structures. And this would maybe ring true from, again, an outsider's perspective looking in, with gangs, particularly, you know, well, the drugs trade, it is quite an affluent enterprise if you can do it well. Like it seems some of these gangs have been able to structure themselves quite rigidly. You know, they've had or been around now for some time, and you know, for disadvantaged young people, they're able to rope them in with promises of riches, or with promises of status, and it's more than maybe what you know, the mainstream is able to provide for them at this particular time in Sweden.
Nils, on that point, talk to me about the young people getting dragged into very, very serious organised crime. This is not delivering drugs. This is going out and carrying out assassinations, gangland hits, using top caliber weaponry, and in some cases even crossing borders into Denmark and Norway to carry out murders.
Yes, we've been studying this phenomenon of gun violence in Europe for quite some time. In the last 10 years, Sweden has really become one of the hotspots for gun violence in Europe, maybe even the hotspot. And this has to do very much with this access to firearms and explosives by very young criminals. In general, the illicit firearms market is characterized by a closed system where you need to have good connections and a very good reputation in order to get access to firearms. And Sweden was one of the first countries where we witnessed that even young people were able to get their hands not just on a pistol, but even on automatic rifles, and started using them. And this is very worrying because this creates a vicious circle of gun violence and firearms trafficking. What we see is that these young people often are very impulsive. They have a fight with somebody and they take out a gun and they start shooting. And this creates a lot of unease and feelings of insecurity amongst the other younger criminals. So they actually want a firearm as well. So this creates more trafficking, and this in the end leads to more availability, which becomes easier for young people to actually shoot the weapons again. So this is the vicious circle we've been seeing for 10 years now in Sweden. And it's a very worrying trend, especially since it hasn't been stopping at all. Not only with firearms, we're also seeing the explosives being used like they are candy. They're throwing them at each other, trying to hit each other. And this is very worrying.
And the impact of all of this on communities and on families is absolutely horrific. One man who lost his son, who had nothing to do with any gang, an innocent victim of all of this. This man is Liban Warasami, and for Roundtable, he sent us this message about his son's story.
Hej, jag heter Liban Warsame.
Hi, my name is Liban Warsame. My son, Hanad Warsame, was murdered on the 29th of December 2020 in Tensta Center outside Stockholm, Sweden. He was 19 years old. He was never in any gang. He never committed a crime, and the police have confirmed it was a misfiring. We have started an association called Stop the Shooting in 2021. The association supports other parents, fathers and mothers and siblings who have lost their nearest and dearest. We make night walks at least 3 times per week to show that we are there, adults for safety's sake. We speak with our young ones. We want the violence to end. We want our children to grow up. We do not want our children to be murdered.
And Kim, there are many, many victims all over Sweden. That story won't be the only one.
No, as experts and academics, we study the statistics, we study the numbers, but behind each and every episode, there's a tragedy, there's a family, there's a community that suffers. That's of course the worst part of all of this, and as we heard before, there's also this vicious cycle that we're seeing homicides, we're seeing executions go unpunished. Police have a lower clearance rate on these incidents than conventional homicides, and this too suffers a vicious cycle where fewer citizens are willing to step forward as witnesses. They no longer trust that the police, we risk that they lose trust in the police, are able to uphold law and order in their community, that the police are willing to use the necessary resources. And if they lose the trust that the authorities can handle this problem and take their problem seriously, then that in turn may worsen the problem even further. At least that's what we've seen in the US. We are not there yet, but we are unfortunately on that track at the moment.
Paul, you and I are both Irish, and we've seen very extensive organised crime in Ireland. The Irish government decided to bring in special criminal courts. They brought in trials without juries, that there was a judge only. They also brought in the Criminal Assets Bureau, CAB, which basically moves in and sees property, businesses, fast cars, money, anything the criminals have accumulated. Do you think there's an argument for the Swedish government maybe following the Irish model here? And I'm not saying we've been massively successful with this, but we have made a start.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you mention and you sort of bring relevance to Ireland, because when I was having a bit of an update on the statistics for Sweden in terms of, you know, the numbers of gun violence, and particularly I was surprised as well to see, well, 1, explosions, and then 2, the amount of them. And where my mind was first drawn to, I mean, as a lecturer, I was sitting thinking, if I was to prepare a lecture to describe the Northern Irish Troubles, I'd be talking about figures quite like that. So that kind of underlined the severity of this issue, and how much it goes against the grain of a point that you mentioned earlier, this perception of Sweden that perhaps outsiders often have looking in. Ireland has brought in, you know, in terms of terrorism and also for gang and organised gang-related violence and criminality, quite strict punitive approaches, and so too has the United Kingdom. They're relatively kind of closely aligned in some respects, the United Kingdom and Ireland, in their approach, albeit perhaps maybe more so towards knife crime. Just picking up, you know, on some of the examples of what the UK has done. I mean, they've brought in legislation in 2018, the Serious Violence Strategy, which was to tackle what we call county lines, drug operations across different counties, where they as well would mirror what we've seen in Sweden in terms of trying to recruit maybe disenfranchised young people. We've also seen the Offensive Weapons Act in 2019, Operation Spectre, which hoped to focus on tackling knife crime with a strong emphasis on, again, gang-related violence. Stop and search powers introduced in the early 2000s for terrorism, and then incorporated into tackling knife crime as well. There's plenty of inspiration, I think, for Sweden. What I would say is that, and sort of going back to a point that has been made by my fellow guests and what I made earlier in terms of the sort of underlying issues for the causation of why this is occurring in Sweden, punitive approaches will only get you so far. Of course, they're needed to a certain degree. We saw this in England as well over the summer with the recent riots and how the incoming Labour government kind of put their foot on the neck of those by increasing police operations. However, that hasn't dealt with the animosity and the underlying sort of right-wing ideology. And I don't believe that purely punitive approaches in Sweden would help either entirely. Those inequalities in society, the underlying reasons for, or the attraction of, or for you, predominantly the youths in Sweden at the minute, that needs to be dealt with adequately. And the United Kingdom does and has provided some legislation and strategies that has had mixed approaches, but nevertheless has had some positive outcomes as well. And one that was first conducted in Scotland, the violence reduction units, they provided some marketable outcomes, an estimated 50% reduction in violent crime over a 10-year period in the city of Glasgow. So there's inspiration for Sweden. And I would, if I were in a position, I would advise from taking a purely punitive approach and look at meaningfully addressing those underlying causes.
Nils, talk to me about what can be done to get young people away from this life of crime and gangs, because social media seems to be driving a lot of this, not just in terms of content, but recruitment and messaging.
Yes, and what we see is that very often the violence is connected not so necessarily with the high-level organized crime groups, but we see that very often in more chaotic criminal landscapes. And this is, I think, a situation in Sweden as well, where you have loosely connected groups which are actually purposely trying to lure very young people into this business model, let's say, which can be very lucrative, especially if drugs are involved. So there's a lot of things we have to do, especially because these young people take a lot of risks. A lot of the shootings take place in public spaces where you see a lot of innocent bystanders being hit. So you need a full approach on trying to prevent these young people in being lured into this criminal world. At the same time, you also have to try to contain the violence as much as possible, which means we need to step up for example, the fight against illicit firearms trafficking, because we see that young criminals adapt themselves and try to find new ways of getting their hands on weapons and explosives, which are very, very dangerous goods, of course. And this is something that has to be done not only in Sweden. Sweden, of course, has to work on the preventive side. But at the same time, this is an international phenomenon, and we need to work together. Many countries, not just Sweden, Norway, Denmark, but many European countries are experiencing the same problem. Maybe not yet to the same extent as Sweden. Sweden is kind of the front runner. But countries in Western Europe, like the Netherlands, like Belgium, like France, like Spain, we're seeing an increase in the shootings. We're seeing an increase in the violence related to street gangs and to drug markets. So this is something we also need to do together, and not just Sweden on its own.
Kim, talk to me about how Swedish people feel when the news comes on and the gunman is a teenager. That these are young kids in Swedish towns and cities, and they're out carrying out the most horrific of crimes.
Shocked, mostly. This teenagers doing these hits, this recruitment from social media, where an advertisement goes up to perform a hit on some middle-aged biker in Denmark. It's so new. We're only, at the moment, I think we're all just shocked and surprised that this is going on, and to the extent that it is. Before some of this spring alone, there were 25 arrests of teenagers, Swedish citizens going to Denmark to try and shoot someone, to throw a hand grenade at a store. So we're shocked, and the public's response is punitive. So when I say we don't really know what to do about it, that's both right and wrong, because we know this is not going to solve the problem, but this is also a very concentrated problem. So 25 teenagers, they're not being recruited by 10,000 different gang members. It is relatively few people that are this unscrupulous that they're doing it. We can do a lot by having police investigate the most serious cases, identifying the people that are brokering these connections between teenagers willing to do hits and organized criminals that need someone to get got. There's a lot to be done there. So Sweden is different from Northern Ireland. The Scandinavian welfare states are very different societies in the international comparison, in that we have a lot of basic preventative efforts built into the welfare states. And we also have very lenient criminal justice systems. So my interpretation of the public's response is that this is new. This is beyond what we can expect the conventional welfare state methods to handle.
Paul, across Europe, other gangs, whether it's the mafia in Italy or organised crime in Ireland, there's a hierarchy, and the older people are the ones pulling the trigger. But in Sweden, this is quite a very, very troubling situation, isn't it? That you've got teenagers who are being given deadly weapons to go and rub out, wipe out, assassinate other gang members.
Yeah, and indeed, there, just as you mentioned, the mafia there as well. I mean, there is some modern iterations as well of mafia factions that we see are can be, at least in some areas, predominantly youth based as well, and youth led nearly. If we talk about sort of age demographics, and again, I think this goes back to a point that I've made before, but it is a point that I think is quite important in that when faced with a lack of opportunities, legitimate opportunities, people will naturally turn to other alternatives, because especially as well, trying to bring together some points you made about this being organized and constructed over online forums, social media and what have you. Things like relative deprivation in terms of a motivating factor shouldn't be chucked by the wayside as a legitimate sort of motivating tool here. People see others who are much more well off and who have much more prosperity and opportunity afforded to them. And I think that the dominant age of the people involved, it speaks volumes about certain societies at times and what those societies are able to offer. And going forward, because this has been sort of an increasing issue now for Sweden over a number of years, and going forward, questions would need to be asked about the ability for how are certain communities within Sweden going to sort of repair themselves so that segregation is an addressed issue, because evolved and established criminal subcultures, they become home to the disenfranchised, and that perception, that internalization of these identities, once cemented, are much more difficult to break through. And yeah, like I said, the punitive approaches can only take you so far. And from the research that I would definitely lean into as better remedies, not cures, but better remedies for issues like this, need to focus much more meaningfully. Money needs to be afforded and resources. I know Sweden has tried, but obviously this issue needs to be addressed much more at the heart of the causational factors.
Nils, is there a worry that the far right will start studying this and exploiting this? And, they're pointing out already that a lot of this crime is coming from migrant communities. These are not indigenous Swedish kids who are going out and committing this crime. Is there a concern that this will be exploited politically?
Yes, of course. And I think this is also what you can see in the results of the most recent elections in Sweden, where the gun violence and the gang violence was really a political issue that has motivated a lot of people to vote for far-right parties. And I think this is important, what was said earlier. It's about punitive reactions, which are, I think, necessary, but at the same time, you need to prevent. You need to work with the local communities as well. local communities often now feel marginalized. And if you don't involve them into trying to find a solution, you will only be very counterproductive. And this will also create more unrest and more political tensions. So it's good to take this very seriously, but that also means that we cannot expect a quick fix. This is going to take years, it's going to take decades. We need a long time effort to make sure that everybody feels safe in Sweden. And this will have to be done in several ways. What we see now is that the violence that is being used is very often instrumental. It's trying to take care of your competition, but it also has a symbolic value. It's also for reasons of reputation. Young people feel like having a gun, feel like being at the core of a lot of violence is actually something that can be glorified. And I think this is also the bigger societal issue that we need to deal with.
Kim, we wish you well. Thank you so much. And to Paul and Nils as well. Excellent discussion. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable, TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.